Congressional Procedure, a practical guide to the legislative process in the U.S. Congress. The House of Representatives and Senate Explained. Richard A. Ehrenberg, author. Chapter 7, The Congressional Budget and Other Special Cases. Table of Sections. A. Introduction. B. The 1974 Budget Act. C. The Congressional Budget Resolution. D. Reconciliation bills. E. The Byrd Rule. F. Pay-go. G. Authorizations. H. Appropriations. I. Government shutdown. J. Debt ceilings. K. Earmarks. L. Other fast-track legislation. M. Congressional Review Act. N. The War Powers Resolution. O. Impoundment and rescissions. P. Line item veto. Q. Review questions. A. Introduction. There are a number of variations in the general legislative process in Congress that come into play in very significant ways. For example, Article 1 of the Constitution imposes great responsibility on Congress for the shaping of legislation controlling taxes and other revenues. Article 1, Section 7. Spending of funds and borrowing to meet deficits. Article 1, Section 8. This is often referred to as the power of the purse. The legislative tools that Congress employs include the budget process, the authorization process, and the appropriations process. Each has a separate function, but they are interrelated and often confused by observers of Congress. It may be useful to think of these in terms of kitchen table finances. The budget is like a personal budget, your plan for how much money you expect to be earning, how much money you will spend, and how you will spend it. Terms. Authorizations. Authorizations may be thought of as decisions you might make that impact your budget, such as signing an apartment lease, buying an automobile, purchasing a home, or even having a child. Term. Appropriations. Appropriations are like payments you actually make under your budget, like paying the rent, utility bills, or buying groceries. You might have budgeted $300 for groceries, but ended up spending $350. Your appropriation is $350. If you spend more than you bring in, you must borrow the difference. If you spend less, you have a surplus and may be able to invest it or save for a child's education. Some of the tools, most notably the budget process, have by law been given special expedited, often called fast track procedures to facilitate more efficient progress through Congress and to the President's desk. While fast track procedures affect both the House and the Senate by imposing time limits on debate, the impact is greatest in the Senate, where debate is otherwise generally unlimited. In fact, in some circumstances, the majority has used fast track let fast track procedures as a loophole in the normal Senate rules to circumvent unlimited debate, for example, the filibuster in the Senate. As an attorney or as a lawyer, a trained lawyer, I don't like the word loophole, even though it's a colloquial, Uh, If I'm allowed to make a left-hand turn on the blinking yellow light, I'm going to make a left-hand turn on the blinking yellow light, assuming it's safe. It is not a loophole that you can do so. It is expected and sometimes caused to happen. Fast track procedures have been granted to other types of legislation as well in trade legislation, treaty enforcement, military base closure legislation, and resolutions regarding the president's ability to commit U.S. armed forces into hostilities. See also the federal budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports, and links on tcncpam.com. End of section A. Section B, 1974 Budget Act. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, PL 93-344, as amended, 2 U.S.C. Sections 601 to 688, was enacted on January 12, 1974, and signed by President Richard Nixon. Beginning with the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, the budgeting process was dominated by the executive branch because the 1921 law gave the president a formal role in the development of the federal budget for the first time. It required that the President submit an annual budget request to Congress prior to its consideration of appropriations and revenue legislation. That act, also created by the Bureau of the Budget, later reorganized the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, in 1971. Prior to 1974, Congress made its appropriations decisions on individual spending bills and revenue decisions on individual tax bills without systematic consideration of how the overall budget was affected. Bills were passed and signed into law, and it was not until the end of the federal fiscal year, September 30, that the size of the deficit or surplus became clear. For much of the history of the United States, the overall budget, and certainly the deficits, except for World War II, or surpluses, were small enough that the system seemed to work. However, for a number of years leading up to the passage of the Budget Act, it began to become evident, particularly as annual deficits grew in the early 1970s, that a more comprehensive, planned, and reasoned approach to budgetary decisions was necessary. Virtually, in 1974, the political will and the opportunity came together. Two important contributing factors led to the passage of the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Acts. First, President Nixon was refusing to spend approximately 12 billion in funding, around 60 billion in 2018 dollars, that had been appropriated by Congress using a procedure called impoundment. See section 7.0. Virtually every prior president throughout U.S. history had impounded funds. However, in those cases, the amounts involved were minimal. Congressional appropriators were generally consulted, and there were good reasons for declining to spend the funds. For example, a program that was no longer needed. Nixon's impoundments were not small, were not agreed to by Congress, and his reasons were controversial. Nixon declared that it was the constitutional right for the President of the United States to impound funds. He pledged, "I will not spend money if the Congress overspends." Many in Congress saw impoundment as presidential usurpation of Congress's control of the purse strings. As this confrontation wore on, it provided some of the impetus for Congress to act. But perhaps most importantly, President Nixon's political standing was weak, and he was absorbed by the Watergate crisis. So Congress was able to overcome his objections. The Watergate scandal led to his resignation a month later, in August 1974, where he understood that he had a vote of no confidence and resigned his parliamentary position. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act was overwhelmingly adopted by the House, 401 votes to 6, and 401 yea votes to 6 nay, and unanimously 95 to 0 in the Senate in June 1974. The act provided a means for Congress to coordinate and enhance its control over the annual budget, and it reduced the ability of presidents to impound funds. Among other things, the act created the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, to provide independent budget analysis to Congress, ending the executive branch's near domination of budgetary information. Congress would no longer be dependent on the executive branch Office of Management and Budget, which is within the executive office of the president. Among the major assumptions at the time of the enactment of the law was that the new budget process would be largely bipartisan. The battles over appropriations, entitlement programs, and the tax legislation could take place within an agreed upon budgetary framework. Also, it was thought that deficits would be reduced by the new procedures since Congress would be required to explicitly vote on them. Both of these assumptions turned out to be wrong almost without exception. When the annual budget resolution comes to the Senate floor, the vote is close to straight party line. Because the expedited procedures under which the resolution is considered reduces the leverage of the minority in the Senate, the majority can bypass the minority and adopt its budget proposal. It is similar to the House. The process envisioned as a way to temper partisanship has instead contributed to the acceleration and broadening of partisan polarization in the Congress. Second, the budget process has not effectively restrained annual deficits. As we will see, at times, budget procedures, see Chapter 7.d, are used to adopt proposals that greatly increase the deficit. The provisions of the Act that created legislative procedures were enacted under the rule-making authority of Congress. As such, these provisions of the Budget Act are similar to Congress in that either chamber is able to amend those provisions that affect its operations without the concurrence of the other chambers without the enactment of a law. As Senate parliamentarian emeritus Alan Fruman has pointed out, if there were technically rules in the Senate, it would take two-thirds vote to invoke cloture to change them. One unusual provision in the Budget Act that applies to both consideration of the Congressional Budget Resolution, see Chapter 8.c, and reconciliation bills, see Chapter 8.d, in the Senate is that although time for debate is limited, 50 hours on the budget resolution and 20 hours on reconciliation, there is no limit on the number of amendments that can be offered. This creates a situation in which a large stack of amendments are voted on after all debate has expired. This process, known as a vote-a-rama, often takes many hours, sometimes 2 days. See also the CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. End of chapter 7, part B. C. The Congressional Budget Resolution. The heart of the process created by the Budget Act is the requirement that Congress pass a concurrent resolution each year known as the Congressional Budget Resolution. This required budget resolution is privileged for consideration and adoption, that is, it can't be filibustered. As a concurrent resolution numbered as H.con.res.xx, meaning number, or S.con.res.xx, or the number, it must be adopted in identical form by both chambers, but it is not sent to the President and does not become law. It creates a binding budget blueprint that Congress is expected to follow throughout as it makes its spending and revenue decisions. It should be noted that when Congress binds itself, it may also unbind itself at the end of the day. The President is required by law to submit a comprehensive budget request to Congress on or after the first Monday in January, but no later than the first Monday in February. The President's budget request is a detailed line by line proposal for all federal programs and is accompanied by multiple volumes of historical tables, charts, legislative and policy proposals, and supporting documents. The budget also includes estimated receipts, expenditures, and proposed appropriations for the following 5 fiscal years. Although some presidents have submitted 10-year budgets, the 5-year plans began with uh, Tsar Nicholas II in his later form. Once the President has developed a budget request and presented it to Congress, the congressional budget process begins. The law requires that this be done on or before the first Monday in February, although that date often slips. Budget decisions are made on the basis of the federal fiscal year. Since 1974, the federal fiscal year begins on October 1 and ends on September 30. The law sets forth a timetable for each procedure step along the way to the adoption of the budget resolution. From the budget reconciliation process, timing of the legislative action, CRS report RL 30,458. An explicit requirement that Congress complete action on any necessary reconciliation measure was established in Section 310F of the 1974 Congressional Budget Act by Section 204B at 99 Stat 1040 of the 1985 Balanced Budget Act, Section 13,210, subsection 2 of the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, Title 13 of PL 108 to 508, Title 13 of PL 101 to 508, deleted this requirement from Section 310F, but left unchanged the reference to the deadline in the general timetable set forth in Section 300. The Senate Budget Committee must report the budget resolution by April 1. This law contains no similar deadline for the House Budget Committee. There are consequences if the Senate Budget Committee fails to meet this deadline. Specifically, should that deadline pass, budget resolutions by individual senators are considered referred to and discharged from the Budget Committee and placed on the Senate calendar. Under these conditions, such individual budget resolutions are privileged for consideration. The law stipulates that the budget resolution must be adopted by Congress by April 15. However, budget resolutions have rarely been completed by this date, and at least 9 times since 1974, no resolution was adopted. Procedures related to the timetable established by the Budget Act are enforced in both chambers by points of order. In the House, these may be waived by a special rule. In the Senate, points of order may be waived by simple majority vote, with the exception of a prohibition against the Senate acting on any appropriations measures until the Appropriations Committee has established the spending caps for each of its subcommittees, called suballocations, that requires a three-fifths vote. The Act requires that the budget resolution establish budget aggregates and spending levels for each broad functional category of the budget, for example, national defense, energy, health, natural resources and environment, and Medicare. In total, there are currently 21 such functions. Procedures related to the timetable established by the Budget Act are enforced in both chambers. Pardon. The budget aggregates required are total revenues and the amount by which the total is to be changed by legislative action, total new budget authority and outlays, the deficit of surplus, and the debt limit. The budget resolution does not allocate funds among specific programs. However, it is common in floor debates and sometimes in the Budget Committee report to detail assumptions underlying the totals for budget functions. These assumptions are not binding. Members, when speaking about proposed amendments to the budget resolution, however, will frequently give the impression that such assumptions are, in fact, substantive changes affecting specific line items in the budget. For example, an amendment to increase the education, training, employment, and social services function by $200 billion may be referred to by its supporters as a $200 billion increase in special education. This is the assumption of the sponsors, but the additional funding may ultimately be spent in an appropriation on some other purpose within the budget function. See also the budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcnpam.com. Section D, Reconciliation Bills. The 1974 budget law also set up a second optional procedure known as budget reconciliation. These are two steps to the implementation of the budget reconciliation process. The first is the inclusion in the budget resolution of reconciliation instructions. Second, legislation known as a reconciliation bill is enacted to change laws affecting spending or revenue. The reconciliation instructions are used to require both House and Senate committees to report changes in current law. Again, the reconciliation instructions are used to require both House and Senate committees to report changes in current law regarding revenues and entitlement spending. These instructions include a dollar amount for an increase or reduction by the legislation to the reported pursuant to those instructions. How the substance of the proposed legislation is to accomplish those instructions is left to the Committee of Jurisdiction receiving the instructions in the budget resolution. If more than one committee receives reconciliation instructions, the recommendations reported by those committees are resembled are assembled by the House and Senate budget committees into one bill. Neither the House nor the Senate Budget Committee, under the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974, can amend the recommendations submitted to it. Although reconciliation bills under the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 are handled with expedited procedures in both the House and the Senate, it is in the Senate where the most dramatic procedural effects of reconciliation and consequently the most controversial impacts occur. Debate in the Senate on reconciliation measures is limited to 20 hours, and as a result, filibusters are not possible. Cloture is therefore not necessary to end debate, and consequently, only a simple majority, not the supermajority, 3/5, normally 60 votes, is needed to end the debate and pass the bill. Also, unlike normal Senate rules, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 requires that all amendments considered on a reconciliation bill be germane. Germaneness is a requirement that an amendment be closely related to the precise subject of the text it proposes to amend. See Chapter 5, subsection J. In another departure from Senate rules, when reconciliation is used for its legitimate deficit reduction purpose, there is the general requirement imposed that all amendments to be in order must not cause a committee to fail to meet its reconciliation instruction, unless the committee has recommended savings in excess of its instruction. This means that amendments must be deficit neutral. Therefore, amendments that increase spending must be offset by language reducing spending by a like amount or raising the necessary revenues. Likewise, amendments that might have the effect of reducing revenue must be offset by revenue increases of a like amount or direct spending cuts matching the revenue loss, typically referred to as mandatory or entitlement spending. The House is not impacted in the same way because it legislates under a special rule reported by the Rules Committee. On reconciliation, the special rule generally expedites the process by limiting debate, amendment, and other action, but this is not outside of the House normal procedures. The expectation of the drafters of the reconciliation process was that it would be used to make minor adjustments in spending and tax bills passed earlier in the year to bring them in line with the budget resolution. The aggressive use of reconciliation as a way to work around the Senate filibuster rules to pass major sweeping legislation was not contemplated in 1974. Beginning in 1981, Congress began using reconciliation bills in a significant way to implement policies laid out in the budget resolution. In 1996, the Clinton administration used the process to push welfare reform through the Congress. In 2003, George W. Bush used reconciliation to pass major budget cuts, with Vice President Cheney casting the deciding vote 51 to 50. Measures like these, which served to increase the deficit or enact major non budgetary provisions, were also not envisioned by the authors of the Congressional budget process in 1974. The principal attraction of using the budget process in this way is the effect of circumventing the filibuster in the Senate because the debate is limited on a reconciliation bill under the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. A filibuster is precluded and the reconciliation bill can be passed with a simple majority. This enables the majority to act on major legislation without input from the minority. See also the federal budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Subsection E, the Byrd Rule. By 1985, it had become clear that the reconciliation process created in the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 was being increasingly used to circumvent the regular rules of the Senate, particularly the filibuster. At the urging of Minority Leader Robert Byrd, a Democrat of West Virginia, the Senate acted to limit non budgetary matters in reconciliation bills by creating a new point of order, commonly referred to as the Byrd Rule. 2 U.S.C. Section 644, Extraneous Matter in Reconciliation Legislation, Senator Byrd, who had been one of the authors of the reconciliation provisions in the 1974 Act, declared it was never foreseen that the Budget Reform Act would be used in that way. So, if the budget reform process is going to be preserved, and more importantly, if we are going to preserve the deliberative process in this U.S. Senate, which is the outstanding, unique element with respect to the U.S. Senate, action must be taken now to stop this abuse of the budget process. The Byrd Rule basically prohibits provisions that do not have an impact on the budget. Byrd's concerns were shared by other senators, and his 1985 amendment was adopted 96 to 0. The Byrd Rule has been extended and modified a number of times. In 1990, it was enacted as a permanent part of the Congressional Budget Act, CBA. It is now Section 313 of that law, 2 U.S.C. Section 644. In 2001, Byrd explained, reconciliation is a non-filibusterable reconciliation is a non-filibusterable bear trap that should be used very sparingly, and I believe only for the purposes of fiscal restraint. That was the intention in the beginning. Reconciliation should be used only for reducing deficits or for increasing surpluses. The Byrd Rule has a significant impact because an effort to waive the rule requires a three-fifths vote of all senators, 60 votes in the absence of vacancies. If a point of order under the Byrd Rule is sustained, the offending provision is struck from the bill, or if made against an amendment, the amendment falls. In this way, if a provision is found to violate the Byrd Rule and the rule is not waived, the advantage gained by use of the reconciliation process, the circumvention of the supermajority requirement under cloture, is negated. The rule is quite complex. However, it can be characterized as prohibiting extraneous matter from reconciliation bills. The Byrd Rule provides a six-part definition of extraneous matter, a provision 1. That does not produce a change in spending or revenues. 2. Recommended by a committee that produces a spending increase or revenue reduction while that committee is not in compliance with its reconciliation instruction. 3. Outside of the jurisdiction of the committee that produced it. 4. That produces a change in spending or revenues that is merely incidental to the non-budgetary parts of the provision. 5. That would increase the deficit for a year beyond the budget period covered by the reconciliation bill. And 6. That recommends changes in Social Security. While the problem of restricting extraneous material in reconciliation is acute in the Senate because of the availability of the filibuster under the normal Senate rules. The House sometimes addresses extraneous matters by including a prohibition in a special rule. The leadership, typically the majority party, supporting the reconciliation bill, and senators hoping to amend the bill will generally meet the Senate parliamentarian to learn in advance whether legislative language will pass muster with the Byrd Rule. These extensive and multiple sessions are referred to as bird baths. A Byrd Rule point of order has an unusual effect in that it strikes individual provisions from a bill that continues to be considered. At times, this feature of the Byrd Rule has been a barrier, intended at least by Senator Byrd, to the use of reconciliation for major sweeping authorizing legislation, like the Affordable Care Act in 2010 or the efforts to fully repeal it in 2017. Early in the consideration of Obamacare, some Democrats, one of the reasons why Republicans wanted to try and repeal Obamacare over and over again is to see if it could be repealed. And when the Supreme Court decided that it could not be, that it was constitutional, all but the mandate, it meant that it's now advantageous to invest in companies like Centene or Kaiser because they'll be around and they'll always be funded. Before that, we didn't know it. It could have just gone away and you would have invested your money for nothing. Early in the consideration of Obamacare, some Democrats advocated the use of the reconciliation process to pass the bill in order to lower the threshold from 60 to a simple majority, 51 if all senators are voting. However, the Democratic leadership, based on strong advice from the Senate parliamentarian and Senator Byrd himself, knew that the legislation contained many non-budgetary items needed to set up an entirely new health insurance system. It was pointed out that the likely effect of many successful Republican Byrd Rule points of order, knocking multiple provisions out of the bill, would be a law that looked like Swiss cheese legislation full of holes. It is a widely held misconception that the reconciliation process was used to enact Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act was adopted in the Senate under regular rules with 60 Democratic votes to invoke cloture under Rule 22, overcoming a filibuster. In the end, a targeted reconciliation bill, the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010, carefully scrubbed to ascertain compliance with the Byrd Rule, was used to strike several budgetary provisions from the ACA to make it more acceptable to the House. See also the federal budget process, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Section F, PAYGO. In 1990, concern about the long-term impact of mandatory entitlement spending or tax cuts prompted Congress to enact a new budget rule popularly called PAYGO or pay-as-you-go. These pay-as-you-go, PAYGO processes and limits on discretionary spending were established under the Budget Enforcement Act of 1890, the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, Title 13 of PL 101 Title 13 of PL 101 to 508. The Statutory Pay As You Go Act of 2010, PL 111 139, 2 USC sections 931 to 939 was enacted in statute under the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. PAYGO requires that increases in mandatory spending, because they have ongoing impacts on the deficit in future years, must be offset by either reductions in mandatory spending elsewhere in the budget or alternatively by increases in taxes. But there should also be increases in revenue of national production, like oil, for instance, or American syrup, which Coca Cola is made from. Similarly, tax cuts, so we need to call in our patents and begin to use them. Similarly, tax cuts projected to reduce revenue in future years are required to be paid for by increases in other taxes or reductions in entitlement spending. The 1990 pay-go provision was sunsetted or ended at the end of FY 2002 fiscal year, although it was replaced by a series of House and Senate rules that were less effective, confusingly also referred to as PAYGO. Statutory PAYGO rules were reestablished in 2010. This version of PAYGO was enacted on a permanent basis. Under the new PAYGO rules, the budgetary effects of mandatory spending and tax provisions enacted into law are tracked on a rolling 5-year and 10-year basis, monitored by the Office of Management and Budget. At the end of the year, if the scoreboards for either of these periods show the effect would be an increase in the deficit, the President must issue a sequestration order. This would require an across the board cut in mandatory spending programs, only those not exempted by previous law. Some programs are exempt from PAYGO sequestration: Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicaid, and other social safety net programs, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, referred to by some as food stamps, are exempt, which increases the severity of the impact of sequestration on programs that are not exempt. Another major exemption is that emergency spending is not included. This explains in part why some administrations have used emergency supplemental bills to finance war. Also, PAYGO does not affect deficit increases arising from changes in mandatory spending or revenues that are projected to occur under existing law. Finally, sequestration under PAYGO has on several occasions been avoided simply by Congress enacting a law instructing OMB to ignore increases in the deficit for that year. See also the federal budget process, and related CRS reports. The federal budget process is at federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. G. Authorizations. An authorization is a law that establishes a program or agency and the terms and conditions under which it operates. Authorizations enable and set up upper limits on the enactment of appropriations for that program or agency. It is an Appropriations Act that actually provides the funding. See Chapter 7, Part H. Senate Rule 16 and House Rule 21 each require that an appropriation, with certain exceptions, may not be considered unless an authorization for that appropriation has been enacted and signed into law. Authorization bills describe what an agency is permitted to or required to do. Authorization bills may also restrict or prohibit actions by an agency. They typically authorize appropriation ceilings that are higher than what the relevant appropriations committee ultimately provides for an agency or program. One way to think of this is that authorizations are like a glass, and appropriations are the milk that fills that glass. Authorization bills can also establish programs under which recipients who meet certain qualifications and criteria are able to receive funds. These are referred to as mandatory spending programs and sometimes as entitlement programs. Entitlement refers to the fact that such programs create a requirement to provide the benefits to individuals who qualify under that law. Examples are Medicare, Social Security, and some veteran benefits. Except for these entitlement programs, authorization bills do not have direct budgetary impact, with some exceptions of small programs that are mandatory, not subject to annual appropriations, but which are not entitlement programs. Authorization bills merely provide the authority for discretionary spending through appropriations bills under the jurisdiction of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. Most appropriations are made on an annual basis. See Chapter 7H Appropriations. Appropriation bills may be permanent or temporary for 1 or more years. Authorization bills that expire require reauthorization. Sometimes politically sensitive programs within a particular authorization can lead Congress to neglect the necessary reauthorization. For example, State Department programs are authorized annually under the Foreign Relations Authorization Act. The programs were reauthorized in 2002, and although the act although the act expired 2 years later, it was reauthorized in December 2016 when the Department of State Authorities Act became law. From 2002 through 2016, Congress avoided working through the many thorny foreign policy issues that would arise in this authorization. By contrast, the National Defense Authorization Bill for the Department of Defense has been enacted into law every year since 1961. Although appropriations require prior authorization under House and Senate rules, there are frequent examples of unauthorized appropriations, especially in the Senate. Often the appropriations bill in question merely waives the applicable requirement. Rules are prohibit Rules also prohibit legislating on an appropriations bill. Legislating refers to language that changes or repeals existing law. However, if points of order are not raised against offending provisions and they become law, there is no legal bar against such provisions. See also the federal budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Appropriations. Appropriations bills allow the federal government to spend money. When passed by Congress and signed by the President, appropriations acts are laws that allow federal agencies to incur obligations and the federal treasury to spend funds. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution states, "No money shall be drawn from the treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law." The founders saw this as a limitation of executive power. James Madison explained in the Federalist number 58, "The House of Representatives can not only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of the government. They, in a word, hold the purse. This power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure." This limitation lies at the heart of the principle of separation of powers. The practice from the very first session of Congress has been to provide most appropriations for no more than a single year, necessitating an annual process. The President is required by law, the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, PL 6713, to submit a budget request to the Congress no later than the first Monday in February. See Chapter 7.C. As part of that submission, the executive branch provides extensive information assembled by the Office of Management and Budget in support of the budgetary proposals the President is making. The Congress considers 12 appropriations bills, each in a separate subcommittee of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. In the 115th Congress, the subcommittees are Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration and related agencies, Commerce, Justice, Science and related agencies, Defense, Energy and Water Development and related and related agencies, financial services and general government, Homeland Security, Interior, Environment and related agencies, Labor, Health and Human Services, education related agencies, legislative branch, military, construction, veterans affairs, and related agencies, state, foreign operations related programs, transportation, housing and urban development, and related agencies. There are three types of appropriations bills considered by the Congress. Regular appropriations bills provide funding to agencies for the next fiscal year, which runs from October 1st to September 30. Supplemental appropriations bills provide additional funding during the year when regular appropriations are insufficient. One common reason for a supplemental appropriation is to fund recovery from natural disasters. Some administrations have also requested supplemental appropriations to fund military actions. For example, much of the funding for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan during the Bush administration were funded through supplemental appropriations. Continuing resolutions are joint resolutions, often referred to as CRs. CRs are frequently used to provide funding for agencies when the normal regular appropriations bills for those agencies have not been enacted into law by the beginning of the fiscal year. CRs often extend the funding at the same level as the last regular appropriations for the agencies affected. Other times, they may increase or reduce funding. For example, CRs have been passed based on adopting the lower amounts provided in a House passed or Senate passed regular appropriations bill. CRs are in effect for a fixed period of time. In recent years, it has often been necessary to enact multiple CRs, often providing the necessary appropriations in place of regular appropriations. Some of these stopgap measures are a short period of time, a matter of days, while negotiations are being conducted in Congress in an effort to pass the regular appropriations bills. At other times, the period is much longer, weeks or months, and in some years, a CR has been necessary to provide funding for the entire fiscal year. In some years, Congress, having failed to enact some or all of the regular appropriations bills, has instead opted to combine two or more appropriations into one piece of legislation. These are referred to as omnibus appropriations bills. These are often considered late in the calendar year before Congress adjourns and when time is limited. As a result, rank and file members often complain they have insufficient time to study these massive bills. Some members who otherwise might support the provisions contained in an omnibus bill feel compelled to vote against it in opposition to the procedure. One senator called these bills a giant ball of wax, referring to the huge size of the bill and the fact other legislation which might not succeed on a standalone basis is attached by the leadership to the omnibus. Smaller omnibus bills, with just a few regular appropriations bills combined, are sometimes labeled minibus bills. The origination clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 7 reads, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. The House has traditionally viewed this as requiring not only that tax bills originate in that body, but all spending bills as well. Although the Senate has never accepted this interpretation, it typically permits the House to go first. This is because the House enforces its position through the blue slip process, see Chapter 1b, rejecting any spending bill that may have originated in the Senate. Before the House or Senate Appropriations Committees act on an appropriations bill, extensive hearings will be held in the relevant subcommittee, and that subcommittee will have marked up the bill. These markups are guided by spending allocations provided under the budget resolution. The Appropriations Committee in each chamber receives a single allocation set out in the Statement of Managers that accompanies the conference report on the budget resolution, known as 302A allocation. The Appropriations Committee chair divides that amount into 12 separate allocations, one for each of its subcommittees. These are known as 30B sub-allocations. In both the House and the Senate, appropriations bills are prepared and marked up in the appropriate subcommittee. The full committee may mark the bill up further, but usually the work of the subcommittee is influential and oftentimes little or no change will occur at the full committee level. In the House, appropriations bills are privileged. See Chapter 4.e. Although, as a privileged matter, appropriations bills do not require a special rule, typically appropriations bills do come to the floor under a special rule, that is, a rule that waives points of order against appropriating funds for programs not previously authorized. See also the federal budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Section I, Government Shutdown. When the necessary appropriations are not enacted into law by the end of the fiscal year or by the expiration of a continuing resolution, once again, when the necessary appropriations are not enacted into law by the end of the fiscal year or by the expiration of a continuing resolution, government agencies that have not been funded must cease operations. Shutdowns are required and governed under the Anti-Deficiency Act. Originally enacted in 1884, the Anti-Deficiency Act, PL 97-258, 31 U.S.C. Section 1341, prohibits federal agencies from obligating or expending federal funds without or in excess of an appropriation. Exceptions are carved out for essential government functions such as the military, federal law enforcement, the courts, and continued functioning of Congress itself. Government shutdowns in recent years have been a consequence of disagreements between the president and the opposition party in Congress. It has become routine for Congress to fail to complete the necessary 12 appropriations bills. See Section 7H by the end of the fiscal year. The last time all 12 appropriation bills became law prior to the beginning of the next fiscal year was in 1996 under my uncle Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House. This has frequently emboldened both parties to use the impending upheaval of a government shutdown as powerful leverage in appropriations negotiations. As in a game of chicken, each side expects the other to give way. This creates the danger of a government shutdown that neither party intends. However, sometimes one party believes it is in their interest, as the Republican Party does not have enough representation in the various government agencies, in part because of the belief system in states' rights, where Republicans have a lot more state control in similar capacities that Democrats don't have. So, for the federal level, sometimes one party believes it's in their interest and in their philosophy. In December 1995, a showdown between President Bill Clinton and congressional Republicans led to the shutdown of the government for 21 days. During the Barack Obama administration, a stalemate between the president and congressional Republicans led to a 16-day closure. In 2018, during the Trump administration, the first one, the government was shut down for 3 days in January. This was a notable occurrence because the president's party controlled the Congress, unlike prior shutdowns. The president's party was Republican. There were 19 government shutdowns between 1976 and 2018. His party before that, President Trump, was Democratic, and maybe after we'll get to Bull Moose and back to Republican. But apparently, we're heading towards a Democratic Republican Party with a radical left and and just a radical left probably. J. Debt ceiling. Another familiar game of chicken between the president and Congress are the periodic battles over the raising of the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is a statutory limit, 31 U.S.C. Section 3101, on the amount that the government can borrow to finance the national debt. The ceiling has existed in law since 1918. A side note by the reader: the United States is based on Rome. It is as if we are a continuation of the Roman Empire, the last emperor of which was, let's say, Hadrian. I actually don't remember. But it ended in the 700s. We continued it, just as Israel is a continuation of an entity that ceased to exist, at least in that region, uh, 2,000 years ago. It's been recreated. Rome had been recreated. As a result of that, Rome is not able to actually mint currency. The currency is minted in Egypt, and there's a copyright issue where you, and Japan also has paid the copyright apparently, but you take anything. It can be wood, it can be lead, it can be something else, and you plate it in a metal. So you take a metal and you put gold leaf around it, or dip it, let's say, in gold, and that is money. And you create as much of it as you want and as you believe your society will have. You can make them as rich or as poor as you like. The reason I bring up Japan is Japan also has a claim they have a claim to Tuscany and to the heritage of having at one point had family members ruling Egypt. So there are places where you can go to create more money. But at the moment, since most people don't know that history, money isn't created. Creation of money is an act of sovereignty. The easiest way for the United States to create money again is by joining the Commonwealth and printing money in that way, or figuring out a way. But until then, when the limit is reached, additional borrowing cannot occur, which would eventually lead the federal government to default on its debts. This has never occurred in American history. U.S. Treasury, at least at the time of this writing, U.S. Treasury bonds are considered among the safest investments by private borrowers and foreign governments alike. Defaulting on these obligations would raise the cost of borrowing for the government, severely impact the U.S. economy, and likely create upheaval in the world's financial market. A fiction which just needs more trees covered in gold that people can exchange for trees printed out, or trees uh, that they live in, or trees that they grow up again. So almost everything we have is made from a tree, or what we call a tree in China, which is metal. It's everywhere. You can melt some down and put some back up again. So uh, let's all move away from that fiction. Both parties have treated the lifting of the debt ceiling as a political football. Since public understanding of the debt limit is limited, it has been easy for politicians to suggest that lifting the debt ceiling is a way of increasing debt. However, the debt in question is typically already obligated, and it's more a question of the government's ability to meet its debts. The opposition party to the president, by threatening an imminent default, attempts to gain concessions. For example, in 2011, the year, the House Republicans refused to cooperate in the lifting of the ceiling unless President Obama would agree to significant cuts in federal spending, uh, things that they may have thought the states would do a better job at, but for many reasons may or may not be true. I think the states are still quite provincial, uh, though some parts of the federal government may be uh, a bit rote. So there's benefit in either one spending money, and so that's why we have two parties. The 2011 debt limit episode was resolved on August 2nd, 2011, when President Obama signed the Budget Control Act of 2011, BCA, PL 112 to 125. Pardon? The BCA included provisions aimed at deficit reduction and allowing the debt limit to rise in three stages, the latter two subject to congressional approval. Once the BCA was enacted, a presidential certification triggered a $400 billion increase. A second certification led to a $500 billion increase on September 22nd, 2011, and a third, a $1.2 trillion increase, or $1,200 billion increase, took place on January 28, 2012. While the crisis was averted, the near miss involved led to a downgrade of the nation's credit rating. In August 2011, Standard& and Poor's, one of the nation's largest credit rating agencies, stripped the United States of its AAA status. S&P declared, "The political brinkmanship of recent months highlights what we see as America's governance and policy making becoming less stable, less effective, and less predictable than what we previously believed. The statutory debt ceiling and the threat of default have become political bargaining chips in the debate over fiscal policy." It is best to have your accurate grade B so you can achieve an A status, or it is easier to then sell yourself, as it were, back into the Commonwealth. Returning, federal debt again reached its limit on December 31st, 2012, the 112th Congress, when Democrats controlled the Senate. Extraordinary measures were again used to allow payment of government obligations until February 4th, 2013, when H.R. 325, which suspended the debt limit until May 19th, 2013, was signed into law. PL 113-3. I apologize for reading the PLs incorrectly earlier. On that date, extraordinary measures were reset, which would have lasted until October 17, 2013, according to the Treasury estimates issued in late September 2013. On October 16, 2013, enactment of a continuing resolution, HR 2775, PL 113-46, resolved a funding lapse and suspended the debt limit through February 7, 2014. On February 15, 2014, a measure to suspend the debt limit, S 540, PL 113-83, through March 15, 2015 was enacted. Once that debt limit suspension lapsed after March 15, 2015, the limit was reset at 18.1 trillion. On November 2nd, I estimate that the United States has about $100 trillion to spend, and when so just keep that in consideration for the next 100 years. On November 2nd, 2015, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 200 goodness. On November 2nd, 2015, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015, BBA 2015, HR 1314, PL 114-74, was enacted, which suspended the debt limit through March 15, 2017, and relaxed some discretionary spending limits. Nonetheless, the one simple fact is clear. No matter the political storm over the debt limit, the ceiling has always been lifted when necessary. The limit has been raised over 80 times from 1960 to 2017. There's a famous author who I like. His name is Robert Kiyosaki. He writes the book Rich Dad Poor Dad and the Rich Dad series. These are books of philosophy, similar to how the art of war, and it may be based on it, is used by corporations. He discusses that when he was building and starting his businesses, he started over 100 in Rich Dad Poor Dad, that And this is much after he explains what Rich Dad Poor Dad is. Rich Dad was a mentor father of his, and his poor dad was his biological father. His biological father arranged, whether he knew it or not, for him to meet this richer guy to gain the skill that that man used to keep his money. He likely inherited it, and then come home to get the skills necessary to make money. And so the combining of the two led to this book, and the combining of those acts of being wealthy and coming from a lack of wealth, but maybe from previous wealth, uh, is that uh, Mr. Kiyosaki and Mrs. Kiyosaki uh, would only live on 10% of their income for the entire year and reinvest the other 90%. You can invest in a bank account. Hopefully, it's insured. You can invest in businesses. You can invest in art and rugs and homes and cars. But the whole point is they invested in, I would say, from my heritage, saved 90%. So the United States is working on about 10% of maybe 18%, if I'm correct, from this time at 2015, of its actual currency, the money that it has, its value, its credit card, our gross domestic product, our gross national product, and they're saving or reinvesting the other 90% in some ways in military and other countries and building the world in space. But it is possible that the United States has far more money. And if we could just develop an efficient bureaucracy full of uh, Kasachra at their head and Shudra working the everywhere else, then we might be able to distribute some more of that money because people would appreciate it. It would be equitable. And we are on our way to that point now. See also the federal budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. And yes, this is an organized effort. But uh, without the material to read, I wouldn't be able to offer you anything, would I? K. Earmarks. One of the controversial aspects of the appropriations process has been the practice and subsequent banning of certain targeted expenditures known as earmarks. Definitions of what is meant by earmark vary. Even the Congressional Research Service, CRS, has had difficulty developing an all inclusive and effective definition. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, used a definition that characterized any expenditure of funds on a specific project not requested by the President as an earmark. Viewed through the lens of checks and balances, this is clearly an executive branch centric view of earmarks, except that the President's required to submit his budget to Congress with his priorities, and they argue from there. And so it is an earmark because you are saying on this page, I want to add something that is relevant to the matter. Um, Presidents frequently embedded earmarks in their budget requests. It is impossible for a president to embed an earmark in their budget request. They make the budget, and everything in it is legitimate. You can discuss as Congress whether or not you will pass it. It is not an earmark. An earmark is a, unless you're saying that people have lobbied the president to place certain things in their budget. Mommy, Daddy, I want a MetaQuest 2. Well, I was going to buy a 50-foot or 50-inch television, so I'll add that into that budget, and it's going to take us a little bit longer to get there. Maybe I can cut somewhere. Right. That is what we mean here. And arguing with the writer of the book, which is exactly what we should be doing. An earmark is a provision in an appropriations bill or, under some circumstances, authorization bill or a tax expenditure contained in a revenue bill focused on a specific program or project requested by a member or members of Congress or in the president's budget. Earmarks typically benefit a single entity or category of recipient. For example, a provision that increases spending for a light rail grant program might not be an earmark, but a provision that requires only an airport exactly 7 miles from the center of a city will receive 20% of the light rail funding would likely be labeled an earmark. Again, without this definition, what we call that in budgeting properly is budget explanation. So I'm giving you, uh, I work in education, residential education, as a Native American, trying to make some improvements there on my way. And I ran a building and I was given a budget. Now, the budget was allocated a particular way. I could allocate the budget with a signatory or two signatories, uh, a resident signatory of leadership, and a supervisor signatory. Or I could have students make a request who lived in the building, and I can get two of their leaders' signatures. So, was the request for something I thought I needed in the building, whether it was a specific vacuum cleaner to be used only in building C and not A, is specifically what I want you to do with it. I'm putting this money here and I did it for this particular reason. If you choose not to follow that next year, for instance, then you have done something against the budget narrative, and whether or not you can oppose the budget narrative may have already been decided by the Supreme Court. I don't know. Although earmarks become controversial for a number of reasons, one was the concern about unnecessary spending during a period of large federal deficits. Most earmarks, however, targeted a portion of an existing appropriation, prioritizing the specified use but not increasing the deficit. In reality, earmarks at their peak account for about 1% of the budget. Often, these earmarks were not contained in the legislative language, but in committee reports or statements of managers accompanying conference reports. I will stop there again and give you a legal principle from that I learned from the current president of the United States, President Joseph Robinette Biden, President Biden, Joseph Robinette Biden, who uh, is another Kennedy that is here benefiting us with a slightly different name. And we all know that Kennedys come from Camelot. So he has some nobility in his heritage. Um, in this current, his chief legislative analyst, when he was a congressman and a senator, I don't know if she's there now, but her name is Victoria Norse. She was a professor of mine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Law, or the Wisconsin Law School. She taught legislation within the law school, and I took that class. I was unable to finish the exam, in part because the question was about uh, Citizens United at that time versus Hillary Clinton, eventually versus the FEC. The professor had a lawyer herself while she spoke about it. And I didn't know at the time, but I'm related to Secretary Clinton through her husband, William Jefferson Clinton, by DNA. And so I decided on my own volition, having written a law exam for my constitutional law course about why President Bill Clinton likely did unconstitutional things from a conservative professor. And I got a pretty good grade on that one. There were a few. He probably could have used me as a legal advisor. I wasn't going to write another one about whether or not I thought, from what I had just heard the previous semester, about Citizens United. And so I just rewrote the exam itself and I left it. And so I ended up with a fail in my law school exam, which dropped my GPA, but it was the moral thing to do. Um, I say all that to say that there is a way the Supreme Court looks at legislation to determine whether or not it is constitutional. One of those ways is to see whether or not what the committees and the legislators said at the time of the writing to determine what they meant by it. And just to kind of read their notes and conversations, what was captured, what wasn't captured. The lawyers really kind of clip it out and make the argument. And so this is more of I've heard it's more of a liberal justice approach, but it is an approach that maybe some of the courts, the previous court, would have called liberal. There's another method, which is more conservative, that says we can't know by these transcripts what a senator meant on a particular day. He may have been making a contrawise argument to make a point. It removes freedom from arguments, is what it said. So often these earmarks were not contained in the legislative language, but in committee reports or statements of managers accompanying conference reports. It may be that those are unconstitutional, given the current makeup of the court. Um, However, if you write in legislation, uh, spend this much money and do this with it, that is constitutional, but it may not be able to occur in reconciliation. And reconciliation is currently what we've been using to pass budgets, and they have to have only financial matters concerning them. And it may not be normal to budget an airport with a specific vicinity. Within a specific vicinity, for one reason or another. So these are I think things are things that will smooth over in the next 25 years. So to continue, for example, in 2005, when there was controversy over a $223 million earmark included in a highway bill to fund the construction of a bridge in Alaska from Ketchikan to a nearby island that had only about 50 residents, and the Ketchikan airport, this was labeled the bridge to nowhere. I laugh because I'm Alaskan native, and this island is in the Aleutian Island range. If you look at Alaska, you see a series of islands uh, heading west. Those are the Aleutian or Aleutian, uh, and they extend down the coast of Canada uh, all the way until they meet Seattle. The last of the Aleutian Islands is Bainbridge, which there is no bridge to from Seattle, but there are bridges connecting the other islands. So there is an argument to be made that they should be Alaska or they are reservations of the Alaskan natives. That $50 that those 50 people are probably researchers. And that airport, why would you build an airport then if there are only 50 people? There's an answer. Uh, that area is very close to Russia. And there are lots and lots and lots of Russian ships over there, and Chinese ships and others in international water. So you may have needed a bridge to connect the two areas together and get to the airport, which is probably the only airport, and everyone in Alaska flies, probably the only airport within 1,000-mile radius. And being able to fly into the airport and then drive your freaking car across a bridge instead of waiting for the snow and ice to melt is significant. And I imagine there's something important there that we don't know about. But because no one knew all that, um, it was called the bridge to nowhere. But nowhere is a place. From 2007 to 2010, both the House and the Senate responded to concerns about earmarks with rules increasing transparency. These rules were in response to the concern about abuses in the approving of earmarks, such as putting them into bills at the last moment. For example, Senate Rule 44 XLIV, adopted in 2007, requires that an congressionally pardon, Senate Rule 44, adopted in 2007, requires that any congressionally directed spending item, limited tax benefit, and limited tariff benefit earmarks, if any, in a bill or joint resolution or in a committee report accompanying the bill or joint resolution. I laugh because I now know what an earmark is, and I'll get to it. Be identified through lists, charts, or other similar means, including the name of each senator who submitted a request to the committee for each item so identified. Also, Senate Rule 44 requires that this information be available on a publicly accessible congressional website in a searchable format for at least in a searchable format at least 48 hours before such a vote. So 48 hours or 2 days before, not necessarily for 48 hours. So I imagine it should stay up. Okay, so there's a speech pattern that you'll find in Francophone Americans. I don't know if they speak French at home, and we don't hear it. I don't necessarily hear their accent. However, it seems that earmarks, and let me find the French for it, is something French. Uh, I've looked it up in French. I'll just continue this. So, for example, Senate Rule 44, adopted in 2007, requires that any congressionally directed spending item, limited tax benefit, and limited tariff benefit earmarks, if any, in a bill or joint resolution or in a committee report accompanying the bill or joint resolution be identified through list charts or other similar means, including the name of each senator who submitted a request to the committee for each item so identified. Also, Senate Rule 44 requires that this information be available on a publicly accessible congressional website in a searchable format at least 48 hours before a vote. Run with premise, please. Um, in the Francophone world, there are people you speak with, and they have certain formal ways you must speak with them. And so, what's done to alleviate that pressure is that symbols are used in certain hand movements and body language, certain half statements, so you can eventually figure out what's desired, especially if it's critical. Now, the Senate has what I call cerulean blue floors. They would call it royal blue. There's a range in that. The royal blue is a French royal blue. Sacre bleu, which is the cerulean blue. But in any case, this is more of a navy blue. And it's the color of the French Senate. And I believe, without saying so, the United States Senate and the French Senate are both Roman institutions, and they work together and try not to step on each other. I don't hear much about the French Senate, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. I hope to hear more soon. So, what is an ear mark? And so I'm using Google Translate, and and so we'll hear it now. Oh, well, may not have gone through the glasses, but it is affectar or les signes distinctifs or les marques à l'oréal. So that's or a signer. Faire une marque à l'oréal. So we just heard that we need every name of the senator who's supposed to who's supposed to who said they wanted it, and literally earmark afectar means a signer who asked for it, who's requiring it. So an earmark is a request by a senator from his or her stance as a senator, saying that in province California, we demand if you would like us to continue participating in the Union and not defect to Japan. So they're threats, actually, that you better do this if. So we need to know who asked for it and to know what it is they're threatening and who they've been talking to. It's a way that we've kept some order. So the earmark is what I began to say was it says tariff here, unlimited tariff benefit earmark. Well, that is a VAT, which is a value added tax. The way you pay for earmarks is with a VAT. And that's the answer to that question. I'm going to finish this. And then I've been posting parts to Twitter to get this up. We're at the budgetary process in March of 2023. And I'm attempting to reach Congress with this method. Social media seems to be the way that we're all interacting. In 2011, a ban on earmarks was imposed by the House and Senate party caucuses. Neither chamber has adopted a rule banning earmarks. However, some contend that banning earmarks removes decision making from elected members of Congress and shifts it to bureaucrats in the executive branch. The ban had the effect of taking a relatively public process, at least after the reforms, and made it less transparent. Some refer to phone marks and letter marks to characterize the ability of Appropriations Committee members and others to deal directly with federal agencies to target funding to programs and projects they favor. This is particularly effective for the members of appropriations committees that control the budget of the agency in question. Another negative impact has been the dismantling of a tool historically used by leadership to negotiate, bargain, and put together support for legislation. Some cite the earmark ban as removing a process that often enhanced and encouraged bipartisanship. Other Section L, other fast track legislation. In an effort to avoid potential filibusters and the burdens of cloture, 161 separate expedited procedures, also known as fast track procedures, have been included in legislation adopted by Congress since 1969. And there's a note here that comment is from, or that quote, Molly E. Reynolds, expectations, again, Molly E. Reynolds, exceptions to the rules. The politics of filibuster limitations in the United States. Washington, D.C., publishers, the Brookings Institution Press, 2007, 185 pages, including the back. A few expedited procedures, in addition to the budget resolution and reconciliation bills, see Chapter 7.C and Chapter 7.D, are of particular significance. Joint resolutions under the War Powers Resolution, PL 93 148, see Chapter 7N, trade implementation fast track provisions based on the Trade Act of 1974, the Congressional Review Act, see Chapter 7.M, and resolutions of disapproval authorized under legislation creating defense base closure and realignment commissions, BRAC, in 1988, 1991, 1993, 1995, and 2005 under the procedures designed for BRAC. The entire package of closures of unneeded facilities recommended to Congress by the Commission go into effect unless disapproved by Congress. See also the federal budget process, federalbudgetprocess.com, and related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. M. Congressional Review Act. Given the complexity of implementing many laws and regulations, Congress regularly delegates rulemaking authority to the President, to the executive branch, and to independent agencies. However, Congress has the ability to oversee such delegated authority through oversight appropriations in the Congressional Review Act, PL 104-121, 5 U.S.C. Sections 801 to 808, passed in 1996, which provides for a period of time to consider and potentially overturn a rule issued by a federal agency before it takes effect. Under the Congressional Review Act, agencies submit a report to Congress laying out the details of a new rule. Any member of the House or Senate may introduce a joint resolution of disapproval of any final agency rule. Congress then considers the joint resolution to disapprove the rule under expedited procedures that provide for a 60-day window in which the Congress may act, and that limits debate on that joint resolution, thus eliminating the possibility of a filibuster in the Senate. This means that only a simple majority is needed in both chambers to pass a joint resolution of disapproval. If both the House and the Senate pass a resolution of disapproval, it may be signed or vetoed by the President. If a resolution of disapproval is enacted by Congress and signed by the President, or if a presidential veto of the resolution is overridden, the rule is voided and cannot be reemployed in substantially the same form unless Congress has enacted a new law authorizing the rule. If the 60-day window for action under the Congressional Review Act does not expire prior to sine die adjournment, a new 60-day clock is available to the new Congress. This provision can be especially significant following a presidential election when the presidency changes hands. During President Trump's first year in office in 2017, the Congressional Review Act was used extensively by the Republican majority in Congress. 15 separate rules promulgated by the Obama administration and independent agencies were disapproved. Since its adoption in 1996, the Congressional Review Act was successfully used to reject a rule only one time in 2001 during President George W. Bush's administration. The War Powers Resolution. The framers of the Constitution, consistent with their design of checks and balances, divided the war making powers between Congress and the President. In Article 1, Section A, Congress is given the power to declare war, the responsibility to raise and support armies, and to provide and maintain a navy. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution states that the President shall be Commander in Chief of the Army and the Navy. The shared responsibilities for sending the U.S. military into hostile circumstances have given rise to tensions from time to time between the President and Congress. In the nation's history, Congress has declared only In the nation's history, Congress has declared war on only 5 occasions, and not since World War II in 1941. Individual declarations of war against countries in World War I in 1917 and World War II in 1941 and 42 increased the technical number of declarations passed by Congress to 11. Presidents have submitted more than 120 reports to Congress pursuant to the War Powers Resolution. To declare war, Congress must pass a joint resolution. This joint resolution is subject to the rules and procedures in both chambers, including the potential for filibuster in the Senate. No senator voted against any of the 11 declarations of war referred to above. U.S. military forces have been involved in combat situations on numerous occasions without a declaration of war. For example, the longest war in the nation's history, the Afghanistan War, which began in 2001, involved as many as 100,000 U.S. troops at one point and cost the lives of 2,400 American military personnel. It was not authorized by a declaration of war and ended by President Joseph Robinette Biden in the year 2020 or thereabouts. The Vietnam War was escalated by President John Kennedy from 1961 to 1963 and President Lyndon Johnson from 1963 to 1969. Public opposition to the war in Vietnam increased substantially from 1963 through 1972, while the war continued under President Richard Nixon from 1969 until U.S. forces were withdrawn from Vietnam in 1975. In response to the growing public opposition, Congress in 1973 enacted the War Powers Resolution, PL 93 to 148, sometimes referred to as the War Powers Act, over the veto of President Richard Nixon. The War Powers Resolution was intended to establish clear procedures for the President and the Congress to follow in situations that might lead to the involvement of U.S. forces in hostilities abroad. The War Powers Resolution requires that the President report to Congress within 48 hours the use of U.S. armed forces in hostilities or in situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. Further, the War Powers Resolution requires that the President withdraw those forces from hostilities within 60 days plus an additional 30 days if the President certifies to Congress that the safety of the troops requires the continued use of such armed forces in the course of bringing about a prompt removal of such forces. The law states that the headline applies in the absence of a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization and can be enforced by Congress by passage of joint resolution. Every president since the adoption of the act, beginning with Nixon, has asserted that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. They assert it is legislative branch interference with the president's authority as commander in chief. Since 1975, just to be clear, if we were in a kingdom, which we are, King Charles III has proper ownership of this land. If the king sends out his even commander in chief, when David sent out uh, the husband Bathsheba, because he was the commander in chief of the Israeli army, to fight, and he disappeared or died, and he accepted his wife as, you know, uh, you would call it a mercy, or she would have been without a husband because of the king, then the commander in chief goes off and does his job. The Congress acts as the king in this respect and commands the commander in chief. So I don't agree. That is unconstitutional. Since 1975, presidents have submitted numerous reports under the War Powers Resolution, usually asserting that they are doing so consistent with the law. The implied distinction is that the action is not taken pursuant to the War Powers Resolution. One notable example was a joint resolution for the authorization for the War of Military Force, PL 107-40, passed by the Congress in the wake of September 11, 2001 terror attacks at the World Trade Center. In the Pentagon, SJ Resolution 23 was signed into law on September 18, 2001. This joint resolution did not invoke the War Powers Resolution. However, reports to Congress mandated by SJ Res 23 have been submitted consistent with the War Powers Resolution. That joint resolution since 2001 has been used at least 37 times in 14 different nations. This footnote, number 2, Matthew Weed, presidential references to the 2001 authorization for the use of military force and publicly available executive actions and reports to Congress. Congressional Research Service, Memorandum, May 11, 2016. The extraordinary expedited procedures contained in the War Powers Resolution are designed to facilitate Congress making a decision about the authorization of the commitment to the U.S. military within the 60 to 90-day deadline imposed by the War Powers Resolution. The fast track provision includes the introduction of a joint resolution and its referral to committee, the committee reporting to the floor or being automatically discharged from its consideration after 24 days for floor consideration and a vote required within 3 days, and further consideration in conference committee if necessary. The unusual fast track procedures can empower any one senator or member of the House to force a vote on a joint resolution restricting the president's ability to commit the armed forces. These unprecedented fast track provisions have come to be called by some the rocket docket, a Wisconsin term. See also related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Section O of Chapter 7, Impoundment and Rescissions. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act of 1964, PL 93-344, 31 U.S.C., Section 1105, reformed procedures for the impoundment of appropriated funds by the President. See Chapter 7.B. An impoundment is the withholding or delay, usually by the President, of funds provided for in appropriations. A federal agency can also impound funds by failing to spend the appropriations allocated to it for a given fiscal year. The Budget and Impoundment Act divides impoundment into deferrals, delays in the use of funds, and rescissions, which are requests by the President that Congress cancel an appropriation. A rescission requires that the President submit a specific request to the Congress. More than one rescission can be listed in a request. Congress has a period of 45 days of continuous session during which it may approve the rescission in whole or in part. If Congress fails to act, the President is compelled to spend the funds for the purpose for which it was appropriated. A deferral also requires a specific request to Congress from the President. Deferrals are limited to the purposes listed by the Anti-Deficiency Act, for example, providing for contingencies or achieving savings through greater efficiency. The President cannot defer funds for policy reasons, for example, to cut overall federal spending or because of opposition to a particular program. See also related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Section P, line item veto. Presidents of both parties have for many years sought authority to veto particular items contained in appropriations and tax bills. See Chapter 6.g. Proponents argue that this would allow a president to eliminate wasteful pork barrel spending and tax loopholes without being required to veto an entire bill they might otherwise support in order to get the offending provisions. In 1996, the Line Item Veto Act, PO 104-130, was enacted on a bipartisan vote. President Clinton supported it, and it was a part of the contract with America that Speaker Newt Gingrich, Republican of Georgia, had used in the 1994 midterm elections to elect Republican majorities in the House and Senate. Under the Line Item Veto Act, presidential proposals would take effect unless overturned by legislative action. The act authorized the president to identify at enactment individual items and legislation that he proposed should not go into effect. Congress had to respond within a limited period of time by enacting a law if it wanted to disprove the president's proposal. Otherwise, the president's proposal would take effect. In 1997 and 1998, President Clinton used the line item veto power to strike 82 provisions from 11 different laws in just 18 months. Senator Robert Byrd, a Democrat of West Virginia, Carl Levin, a Democrat of Michigan, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat of New York, opposed the law and immediately challenged it in federal court. In 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that the senators lacked legal standing to bring the case. However, the senators joined a subsequent case in 1998 through amicus curiae briefs, friends of the court, in a 6-3 decision. In June 1998, the Supreme Court in Clinton versus City of New York, 524 U.S. 417, 1998, ruled the Line Item Veto Act unconstitutional. In the years since the 1998 ruling, presidents have continued to ask for some form of line item veto that might pass constitutional muster. There have been various proposals for enhanced rescission authority, under which the president could propose rescissions under expedited procedures that Congress would be forced to act on. However, no such legislation has been enacted. See also related CRS reports and links on tcncpam.com. Q. Review questions. Explain why presidents with majorities in both chambers might prefer the use of reconciliation bills to enact major legislative agenda items. Why do presidents of both parties favor the line item veto? What are rescissions and deferrals? What is the main objective of the War Powers Resolution? What is an earmark? What is meant by expedited procedures in the Congress? Give 2 examples of legislation that contain expedited procedures. What is the debt ceiling and why is it controversial? Why has the Congressional Review Act been used extensively since its passage in 1996? When has the Congressional Review Act been used extensively since its passage in 1996? Compare and contrast the appropriations process and the authorization process. How do these relate to the budget resolution? What is the purpose of PAYGO? And that is all for Chapter 7.